38-year-old John Mitchell was a Chicago police officer known for his courage and dedication to service. He had joined the police force straight out of high school, following in the footsteps of his father, who had also been a police officer. For John, the profession was more than a job, it was a calling. He believed deeply in his mission to protect and serve his community, and this conviction was evident in all of his actions. Married to Emily, an elementary school teacher, John was the father of 2 children, Sarah, aged 10, and Lucas, aged 7. The family lived in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago. Emily has always admired John's dedication to his work, even though she lived in constant fear that one day he might not come home. Sarah and Lucas saw their father as a hero, even though they didn't fully understand the dangers he faced daily. At work, John was respected by his colleagues. He was seen as a natural leader, someone who was always willing to help others and put the team's safety first. His patrol partner, Mike Thompson, was his best friend and confidant. They had been through many difficult situations together, and the trust between them was unshakable. Mike knew he could count on John in any situation, and this partnership made the work less hard. Despite his bravery and confidence in his work, John carried a silent fear. He knew that every day could be his last and that any emergency call could be fatal. This fear, however, was something he never shared with Emily or his children. To them, John always presented himself as a strong, steadfast figure, someone who would never fail to protect them. In his free time, John enjoyed spending time with his family. They often had picnics in the park, went to baseball games, and spent quiet evenings watching movies. These moments were precious to John, as they allowed him to disconnect from the stresses of work and focus on the things that really mattered. He knew that although he loved his work, his family was the most important part of his life. However, even in moments of joy, the shadow of danger was never far away. Emily often caught John looking at his children with a distant look, as if he was trying to memorize every detail of their faces. He knew that life was uncertain, and this thought haunted him even in moments of happiness. Still, he continued, believing that his dedication to duty was the best way to ensure the safety of his family and his community. It was a morning like any other when John left home for work. He kissed Emily, promising to return for dinner, and hugged his children before leaving. The morning routine was always the same, but there was a strange sense of restlessness in the air. John couldn't explain it, but there was a weight in his chest, a feeling that something wasn't right. He ignored the feeling, chalking it up to tiredness, and headed to the police station. Upon arriving at the police station, John met Mike, who also seemed a little uncomfortable that morning. They briefly discussed the day's schedule, which included routine patrols and some ongoing investigations. However, before they left for the first round, an urgent call interrupted their plans. An armed robbery was in progress at a downtown convenience store, and all available officers were called to respond. As they drove quickly to the scene of the crime, John tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had been with him since the morning. He knew that these situations were always unpredictable and dangerous, but he couldn't let fear paralyze him. Mike, noticing John's unusual silence, asked if he was okay. John just nodded, focusing on the task at hand. He knew he needed to be fully alert to what was coming. When they arrived at the scene, the situation was already tense. The suspect was inside the store, armed and holding employees hostage. John and Mike, along with other officers, began to put together a plan to negotiate the suspect's surrender without anyone getting hurt. However, time was against them, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every second that passed seemed like an eternity, and John felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Suddenly everything happened very quickly. The suspect, upon realizing the presence of the police, panicked and began shooting. John, following his instinct, ran to protect the civilians, but was hit in the chest by one of the shots. The pain was immediate and excruciating, and he fell to the ground as chaos exploded around him. Mike shouted his name, running towards him, but John could no longer hear clearly. His vision began to darken, and he felt like he was losing consciousness. As the world around him faded, John had one last thought before everything went black: his family. He thought of Emily, Sarah, and Lucas, and desperately wished he could see them one more time. And then, silence took over. John felt like he was floating in an infinite space. The pain and chaos of the shooting had disappeared, and he found himself enveloped in a deep sense of peace. There was no sound, there was no pain, just a calm he had never experienced before. John didn't know where he was, but strangely enough, he wasn't afraid. There was something calming about that place, something that made him feel like everything was okay despite the circumstances. As he floated in this state of serenity, John began to realize he was not alone. Figures began to form around him, familiar figures he hadn't seen in many years. His mother, who had passed away when he was still a teenager, was there, smiling at him with a look of unconditional love. His father, who had died a few years earlier, also appeared, waving to him. John felt a rush of emotion when he saw them, as if all the years of separation had disappeared in an instant. "You're okay, son," his mother said, her voice echoing softly around him. "We are here to guide you." John couldn't respond, but he felt a tear run down his face when he saw the look of pride and love in her eyes. Around him, other figures he had lost throughout his life began to appear, friends, colleagues, all smiling, as if they had been waiting for him. However, despite the happiness of seeing his loved ones, something inside John was pulling him back. He began to remember his life, Emily, Sarah, Lucas, and a sense of urgency began to grow within him. He wasn't ready to leave. There were so many things he still wanted to do, so many promises he wanted to keep. The feeling of peace began to mix with a desperate need to return, to not leave his family behind. "It's not your time yet," said his father, as if reading his thoughts. "You have more to do." The words echoed inside John, and he felt an unknown force beginning to pull him away from that place of peace. He looked at his parents, at the friends he had lost, and felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "We will always be with you," said his mother, as the light around them began to shine brighter, dimming his vision. Suddenly, John felt like he was falling, being pulled back into his body. The peace and serenity were replaced by a sense of urgency and pain as he fought to get back. And then, with a sudden shock, he was thrown back into reality, the sound and pain of the physical world hitting him like a wave. John woke up to a rush of pain and confusion. The sound of sirens and voices around him was deafening, and he could feel someone's hands pressing on his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. His eyes slowly opened, and he saw Mike's face above him, eyes filled with panic and relief. "He's back. Hang in there, John. The paramedics are on the way." Mike's voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater, but John knew it was back. The pain was intense, but John tried to focus on breathing, remembering what he had just experienced. He wondered if it had all been a dream, an illusion caused by blood loss. But the feeling of peace, the sight of his parents, it all felt so real. He clung to that memory as the paramedics arrived and began treating him. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt like something inside him had changed. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher and prepared him for transport to the hospital, John looked up at the sky, trying to find some sign of where he had been. But all he saw was the clear blue of an autumn morning. He closed his eyes, trying to commit every detail of that experience to memory. He knew that somehow it had been real, that he had been on the brink of death and come back. And now, he needed to understand what this meant for his life. At the hospital, as doctors rushed to stabilize him, John was consumed by a deep sense of gratitude. He had been shot, he had been close to death, but now he was alive. He thought about Emily and Sarah and Lucas, and how he wanted to see them, to hug them, to tell them he loved them. As the anesthesia began to take effect, he promised himself that if he had a second chance, he would live each day as if it were his last. When John woke up after surgery, he was exhausted but relieved to see Emily by his side. She was holding his hand, her eyes swollen from crying, but there was a smile of relief on her face. "You came back to us," she whispered, squeezing his hand. John tried to smile, feeling a rush of love and gratitude for being alive, for having the chance to continue living his life with those he loved. In the days following his recovery, John spent a lot of time reflecting on his experience. He couldn't get the visions he had seen while he was between life and death out of his head. His parents' words, the feeling of peace, the certainty that there was something beyond, it all left him with more questions than answers. John had always been a practical man, someone who believed in what he could see and touch. But now, he no longer knew what to believe. Emily noticed that something had changed in John. He was more introspective, spending hours in silence, lost in thought. She tried to talk to him about what had happened, but John couldn't find the words to describe what he had felt. He knew Emily was worried, but he needed time to process everything before he could share it with her. While recovering at home, John began searching for answers. He read about near-death experiences, trying to understand if other people had gone through something similar. To his surprise, he found countless stories that echoed his own experience. People who had felt the same peace, seen loved ones gone, and returned with the knowledge that there was something beyond this life. These stories comforted him, but they also left him uneasy. If so many people had gone through this, what did it mean? One night, while Emily and the children slept, John sat alone in the living room, looking at a photo of his family. He thought about the second chance he had been given and wondered how he should live from now on. The experience had changed him, but he still didn't know exactly how. He felt grateful to be alive, but he also felt a new responsibility, as if he had been chosen for something greater, something he still couldn't understand. John also began attending a local church, something he had never done before. He was not a religious man, but he felt the need to connect with something greater, to find meaning in what he had experienced. The church pastor, a kind and wise man, patiently listened to John's story and encouraged him to look within himself for answers. "I believe we all have a mission in this life, John," said the pastor. "Maybe your experience is a sign that there is something more you need to do." These words resonated deeply with John. He began to see his life and work in a different way. The protection he had always offered his community now seemed part of something bigger, a mission that he needed to fulfill with even more dedication and love. He knew that the journey to understand what had happened was just beginning, but he was determined to move forward, looking for the answers he needed. John's near-death experience not only affected him, but also his family. Emily, who had always been a strong and pragmatic woman, began to feel the weight of the fear of losing her husband. She knew John's job was dangerous, but seeing him so close to death had intensified that fear in ways she never imagined. Even as she cared for John during his recovery, Emily struggled with her own feelings of vulnerability and insecurity. Sarah and Lucas, still too young to fully understand what had happened, realized that something had changed. Sarah, especially, noticed that her father was different, calmer, but also more distant. She tried to ask him about what he had experienced, but John always answered vaguely, trying to protect his children from what he himself was still trying to understand. However, the connection between them deepened, as if the experience had brought a new layer of understanding and love to the family. Emily and John began to have deeper conversations about the future. John spoke about his reflections, the need to live with more purpose, and how he wanted to spend more time with his family. Emily, while relieved to have him back, was also worried about what these changes would mean for John's career. She knew how much he loved being a police officer, but she also saw that something inside him had changed irrevocably. The relationship between John and Mike also changed after the incident. Mike, who had been the first to help John in the shooting, felt guilty for not being able to protect his friend. Although John tried to reassure him that there was nothing Mike could have done, the dynamic between them became different. Mike noticed that John was more introspective and less likely to get involved in unnecessary risky situations. They were still a strong team, but the incident had left a mark on both of them. Over time, Emily began to better understand what John was going through. They began to talk more openly about the experience, and John eventually shared the details of his NDE with her. Emily listened intently, feeling a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Although it was difficult for her to fully understand, she knew this was something John needed to process in order to move forward. And so, together, they began to rebuild their lives, with a new perspective on what really mattered. As John continued to regain his physical strength, he also dedicated himself to strengthening ties with his family. He began to participate more actively in his children's school activities, plan family vacations, and create special moments with Emily. The near-death experience had made him realize that time was precious, and he was determined to make every moment count. Although the road ahead was still full of questions, John knew he wasn't alone. He had his family by his side, and that was what mattered most. After his near-death experience, John began to reconsider his career as a police officer. Although he still felt a deep sense of duty to his community, he could not ignore the internal changes that had occurred. The experience had given him a new perspective on life and death, and he began to wonder if his true purpose was still to patrol the streets or if he should take another path. This doubt accompanied him daily, affecting his motivation and focus at work. John began to explore other ways to serve his community that did not directly involve the constant risk of life and death. He considered joining the investigation department, where he could use his experience to solve crimes more safely. Another possibility he considered was becoming an instructor at the police academy, training new recruits and sharing his life experiences. He felt he had a lot to teach, especially after his near-death experience. During a conversation with Mike, John revealed his thoughts on a possible career change. Mike, who had also been impacted by the shooting, understood his friend's feelings. "Maybe it's time for you to do something different," Mike said. "You've already done a lot for this city. No one will judge you if you decide to follow a new path." These words resonated deeply with John. He knew Mike was right, but the decision was still difficult. Emily was fully supportive of John exploring other options. She knew how much he loved being a police officer, but she also knew that the near-death experience had changed his priorities. "Maybe you can find a way to continue helping people, but without putting your life at risk every day," Emily suggested. John agreed, but there was still a feeling of guilt when he considered leaving the patrol, as if he were abandoning something that had always been part of his identity. John finally decided to take an extended leave of absence so he could better reflect on his future. During this time, he began to become involved with community organizations, volunteering in violence prevention programs and supporting families of crime victims. This new phase of his life brought a sense of renewed purpose, allowing him to continue to serve his community but in a way that also nourished his soul. At the end of this period of reflection, John made the decision to retire from patrol and dedicate himself to community work full-time. He became an advocate for victims' rights and began organizing talks about violence and the impact it has on families. Although the transition wasn't easy, John felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. His near-death experience had led him on a new path, and he was determined to move forward with purpose and gratitude. As John delved deeper into his new role in the community, he began to realize that the near-death experience had given him more than just a second chance to live, had given him a new purpose. The work he did now, helping people deal with the pain and trauma of violence, was deeply rewarding. He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, using his skills and life experiences to make a real difference in people's lives. John began to realize that his near-death experience had been a catalyst for this change. He remembered his father's words during his NDE, "You have more to do." Now, he understood what his father meant. He had been spared to fulfill a mission, and that mission was to help others find hope and healing in the midst of darkness. This revelation brought a new peace to John, something he had never felt before. In his work, John met many people who had gone through traumatic experiences similar to his own. He became a mentor and counselor for those who were struggling to find meaning after being victims of violence. John shared his own story, not as a lesson, but as a way to show that even in the darkest circumstances, it is possible to find light. He saw how his words and actions helped others find strength and resilience, and it brought him deep satisfaction. Emily, upon seeing John's transformation, felt a mixture of relief and pride. She knew he had found his path, something that made her heart vibrate with the same enthusiasm he had felt as a police officer. She continued to support him, knowing that this new phase of his life was what he needed to find the peace he sought. They became even closer, sharing the joys and challenges of this new journey together. Sarah and Lucas also noticed changes in their father. They saw how he was more present, more emotionally connected to them and the world around him. Although they were still young, they began to understand the depth of what John had experienced and how it had shaped the man he had become. To them, their father was not just a hero for being a police officer, but for his ability to transform pain into compassion and service. Looking back, John realized that the near-death experience had been a gift, an opportunity to reevaluate his life and find a deeper purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it with an open heart and a mind focused on what really mattered, helping others and living each day with gratitude and love. John's near-death experience brought a new perspective on life that he had never considered before. He began to value every moment, every interaction, in a way that had previously gone unnoticed. Things he had taken for granted, like simply being with his family or watching the sun rise, now had profound meaning. He understood that life was fragile and that each day was an opportunity to do something meaningful. John also began to connect more deeply with the people around him. He learned to listen more carefully, to be truly present in conversations and to value other people's stories and experiences. He realized that while everyone has their own struggles, there is incredible power in sharing those experiences and supporting each other. This brought a new richness to their relationships, both personal and professional. Another significant change was the way John dealt with fear and uncertainty. Before, he had been a man of action, someone who faced danger head-on without much question. Now, he understood that fear was a natural part of life, but that it didn't need to be an obstacle. Instead, he used fear as a tool to connect more deeply with his own vulnerability and that of others. This made him more empathetic and more aware of his own limitations, without weakening him. Emily noticed this change in John and was impressed by the calm and wisdom he displayed. She knew that the near-death experience had left an indelible mark on him, but she also saw how he had grown and transformed because of it. They began to have deeper conversations about life, the future, and what really mattered to them as a couple and as a family. These conversations strengthened the bond between them and created a solid foundation for the future. Sarah and Lucas, although they still didn't fully understand the depth of John's transformation, felt the difference in his presence. He was more involved in their lives, more attentive to their needs, and more willing to share meaningful moments with them. They began to see their father not just as a protector, but as someone who was truly present in their lives, and this created a new layer of trust and love between them. In the end, John understood that his near-death experience had not just been an isolated experience, but a turning point in his life. He had learned to value life in a way that previously seemed impossible, and this gave him the strength and motivation to live each day with purpose and gratitude. He knew life was short and unpredictable, but he also knew that while he was here, he would do everything he could to make it meaningful. John Mitchell was never the same after his near-death experience, and he knew it. What began as a tragic incident turned into a journey of self-discovery and growth that impacted not only his life, but also the lives of those around him. He became a man more aware, more compassionate, and more dedicated to making a real difference in the world. He knew he had been spared for a reason, and he was determined to fulfill the purpose he was given. John's legacy was not limited to the community work he did. He was also dedicated to educating others about the value of life and the importance of living with purpose. He began giving talks about his experience, sharing what he had learned about life, death, and what comes after. His words touched many people, inspiring them to reflect on their own lives and seek greater meaning in everything they did. Emily, Sarah, and Lucas were the biggest beneficiaries of this transformation. They gained not only a more present husband and father, but also an example of resilience and courage. John's experience brought them together in ways they never could have imagined. The family has become stronger, more connected, and more focused on living a full and meaningful life. Together, they found a new way to face life's challenges, knowing that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. The community also benefited from John's new mission. He helped create support programs for families affected by violence and worked tirelessly to promote peace and understanding. Her story of survival and renewal became a symbol of hope for many, showing that even in the most difficult situations, it is possible to find light and redemption. Looking back, John knew that his near-death experience had been the most transformative event of his life. He had faced death and returned with a new perspective, a new mission, and a new understanding of what really mattered. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, and he was determined to do so in a way that honored the second chance he had been given. John lived the rest of his life with gratitude and purpose, knowing there was something greater that he didn't yet fully understand, but that guided his every step. He knew that in the end, all that really mattered was love, compassion, and the desire to do good. And so, he continued his journey, inspired and motivated by the experience that changed his life forever.